Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast. Hope everybody's having an absolutely fantastic day. We are back to talk about synergy in our gardens, and this is a series of multiple things that once we get it right, will totally transform your garden. We're going bold, and it will
hmm
transform your garden in the way it grows, but each piece is an important part of the puzzle. I'm trying to get my hands in the camera because we're on YouTube. There we go. Yeah. Leonard's not changing the camera angle. So, yeah. So, these are short episodes. They're originally released on YouTube. So, thank you so much for watching us on YouTube. And if you haven't, please do so. And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by becoming a patron, an Apple subscriber, or buying some seeds from our seed shop. So, use the code YBBBB and get yourself a discount and year round free shipping, $35 or more. And we have all kinds of seeds. So please check that out and enjoy it and get your garden going. And when you get those seeds, just know that you can apply this synergy to your garden. And I'm going hard with this word, even though I hate it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how it if it really fully applies, but I'm gonna row with you because that's how I roll.
Yeah. Yeah. So today's subject is varieties. Okay. So we touched on it a little bit in the last one, and now we're kind of going a little bit deeper. So varieties. So in your opinion, can varieties really change your garden?
It can and it has. I'm living proof of it. And it's interesting because I don't know that I went into this last 6 years of gardening with the understanding that I was kind of testing out varieties, but that's absolutely what I was doing. Right. So not only what grows best in my garden, what do I like most, right? And that all really ties back to the variety. This is obviously a step underneath you've chosen the crop itself, right? So for the purpose of this episode, clearly that should already be done. And now you're talking about a particular variety
Yeah.
of that crop.
Yeah, exactly. And I think right off the bat, I think the problem a lot of people have, and I've experienced this, is you get something, it produces well, and you want to stick with it until the cows come
Mhm.
home. And that works really well. But there are times in which we can change our variety and really alter the course of your garden throughout that season. So, I used this before where I had a gentleman come up to me. He was buying some seeds, and he had, or some, not seeds, some seedlings, and he asked me, he said, "Well, do you sell Bonnie peppers?" And I said, "No, I don't sell Bonnie peppers." He said, "Well, that's all I ever grow because they grow the best." And I'm like, "Well, what else have you grown?" He's like, "Well, nothing because that's all I've ever grown." And it's like, okay, so at this point, you don't even know what you're doing. Cool, don't buy them, not for sale. And he went on, but as we know, when you start to change, or not everybody, but as Batavia's found out, and I'm finding out each year, as we change our varieties, things can happen a lot different, and it can be a slight change. It could be totally different. It really depends. Tomatoes are a great example too.
Yeah. Yeah. There are not a lot of tomatoes that, well, I won't say it that way. Many tomatoes perform in different ways in the same garden. So I'm surprised you started off with, people are kind of stuck with the varieties and sticking with the varieties that they like. But I agree now that you say it out loud. It's interesting because if I come and try to piggyback off of that, I'd also say that for when you try to change the variety, like how often are you changing it? So I'm going to say give a particular variety a couple of shots in your garden,
Yeah.
right? 1 year's experience with, aroma tomato plant is likely not enough to give you a full reading on how aromas grow in your garden, right? Does that mean that you should grow something you're really not crazy about a second year just because? No, right? But don't write something off because you've had something, growing in your year for a single season. And to Young Ben's point, you have something that either is working just okay or maybe you may be enjoying, it's okay to play around and introduce a different variety because you would be surprised in many cases the difference you'll see in them. Beans are a great example of that. When it comes to green beans, as an example, tomatoes are a great example of that. I mean, kale, if we go back to spring and cool weather crops, There's so many different varieties of kale, and I've seen them by the same growing bed perform very different in my
Yeah,
garden.
absolutely. And I mean, yeah, so green beans, absolutely. And the thing about green beans is you can grow pole beans or you can grow bush beans, right? And we talked about this in a recent episode, but Batavia had a big green bean win. And I'm going to go ahead and use your story and tell it like it was mine because it makes me feel good if that's okay with you. But
Absolutely okay.
she, I asked her the question at the end and I said, well, what do you think? Do you think that the bush green beans produce, you know, earlier or more or both? And, it was clear it was earlier. They produce earlier because they don't have to produce all of that plant mass up from the bottom to create and support the beans. So that in itself is different. And I mean, look, with that, you're kind of doing two multiple things with that. One, with that particular variety selection, you're doing an earlier harvest potentially. You could put more plants in a smaller space. You could grow them when you don't have a trellis. There's a lot of different options, and bush beans are an easy one to go through.
Mhm.
And the tomatoes, it's indeterminate or determinate. You know what I mean? Like those are easy, but like if you start and you go outside of those easier ones, and we go from there, what are some of the benefits? Like, I guess what I'm asking you, Batavia, is what are some varieties that you've noticed that have really changed in your garden? I think that's the best way to go about this.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think that, the ones that I just named are probably the best ones. No, I think that we mentioned broccoli in the last episode. I think cabbage is a really good example. So there's a shorter day cabbage versus a longer day cabbage, something that's said to be produced in 85, 90 days would be the shorter. And then some that's 110 to 120 days as the longer, right? For me, a longer producing cabbage has been more successful. It really has time to set its roots to develop, right? And my weather can tolerate it because it's growing for 100 plus days. So I think that's a really good example. Tomatoes, it's more of my growing space, not necessarily my growing climate. So determinants, they do come on hot and heavy. And depending on what I want to do with tomatoes for that year, that can make the difference. When it comes to indeterminate, which generally is my preference because I feel like I have more choices, it is harder to keep those healthy for the duration, right? And so that's going to make a difference ultimately in the harvest and the work that I need to put into the garden when it comes to maintenance.
Yeah, and I mean, tomatoes keep creeping up, and I do want to say this. If you have a shorter growing season, look for a variety that is, excuse me, is produces earlier, so that you can start to get your harvest a lot earlier than normal, and really get it so that it works for you, and you're not sitting there trying to figure out like, hey, why am I not getting a harvest? What am I doing wrong? When in fact, what the problem could be is simply just the variety that you're doing. So a lot of times we'll be missing certain things, we'll have issues, and you can fix it with the variety. And I think just to go over real quick, some of the issues that we can fix would be, I mean, there's a long list, but you can do heat sensitivity, cold sensitivity, spacing issues.
Mhm.
And that goes into multiple directions as far as like how wide they get, how tall they get. Do they trellis? Do they
Mhm.
not trellis? Disease resistance, pest resistance, fruit shapes. You could even get down to the way you preserve and what you do. There's so many things you can do with
Mhm.
variety. It's insane. I've gotten to a point, and let me know if you do this too now, Batavia, or if you're getting there, where I'll look at my garden and say, hey, I'm having this issue. And one of the things that I'm starting to do is take a step back and look at the garden and say, hey, can the variety fix this issue? Can I change whatever issue I'm having simply by changing the variety and not really doing much of anything different?
Mhm. Yeah, I think I've stumbled into it, as I like to say, but from the different end. If I'm looking at a particular package of seeds and they'll highlight oh, they may be drought tolerant, they may be resistant to a common disease with that particular vegetable. Um, I will stop and say, have I been having that issue? Right? Like if that's a differentiator, is that an issue that I'm trying to resolve? And then I'll lean into whether or not, if it is, then okay, yeah, this may be a seed that's, worth purchasing. But if I'm not having that issue, like I kind of it's on an even playing field. It gets no more points in my garden or to my consideration. So I look at it the opposite way. I do check every now and again if I have a reoccurring problem to check to see if there are plants out there that are kind of designed to fight that.
Right.
The issue that I had with winter squash, butternut squash in particular, and I've only had it a couple of years where I've not been able to get the plants growing and then squash producing and ripening on the vine in the time I have in the growing season. Just based again on the last episode when we were talking about timing, so that plays a factor. And so what I looked for was, or what I came across was a smaller variety of kind of winter squash that's very similar to butternut squash. It was the honey nut squash that I grew this past season. And it's going to mature. It's going to actually produce fruit and then mature much quicker than your traditional butternut squash. Problem solved. And it's actually better tasting, if you ask me.
So I'm not exactly impressed with you right now because honey nut squash is one of the squashes I was super excited to grow last year and totally forgot to grow. So I'm not happy. You keep bringing it up too. I don't know if you realize that, but you keep rubbing it in my face. That's what a good friend does, everybody.
So I didn't know.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
I didn't know, but now that I do, I'm going to make it my business to rub it in.
So, so I want to get into the hot topic here. Mm-hmm. Hybrids or heirlooms. Okay. I really want to talk about, we've talked about it a lot, but I think it deserves to be talked about in this subject because this is so important. In a 30-second clip, Batavia, what do you think about hybrids or heirlooms? Do you think that it's cheating the system, or do you think that, even if you're organic, you can use hybrid? Like, how do you feel about it?
I feel like I've walked back from that place of, heirlooms are the way. It's going to be the way I go for the majority of my garden. I like the whimsicalness of heirlooms, the kind of story that they're ultimately telling based on their existence. And I'm still pro heirloom, but I absolutely lean into hybrids just because it gives me a variety to choose from. It gives me more of a variety to choose from. And some of the issues that you were talking about earlier on, some of these hybrids have been designed to combat those issues, right? So I think for me in my garden space right now, I'm going the easier route, to be quite frank. And oftentimes that comes across in what's in a hybrid package.
Yeah, I don't like the word that you use, designed. The word that I like, because designed implies genetically modified. The word that I like is bred, because that implies that it's a natural helping hand man process, man-made helping hand simply by cross-pollinating flowers. But you're exactly right. I agree the same way. And I like that you bring up the whimsicalness of it, because it is the story behind a hybrid and the longevity that plant's been around is heirloom, excuse me. Heirloom is very important. I'm glad you're here, because otherwise I'd be putting a caption in and everything. It'd waste a lot of time. I'm glad you're here for more than just that. But yeah, the story is really important. But what I will say, and Batavia and I are in a position where we talk to a lot of gardeners every day, every week. And a lot of times when we get questions and, typically it's like, help, it's a hybrid or it's an heirloom plant. And heirlooms are notoriously more difficult to grow. Not saying they're impossible, but inherently they're more difficult because they don't have these traits within them that were bred into them in order to help. And so I like to look at hybrids as simply a crutch to help me. And it, like with my Brussels sprouts, hands down, after 4 years, the only reason why I ended up getting a harvest is simply because I switched to a hybrid and it helped me to get there. And I'm okay with that. The
Yeah.
biggest thing with heirlooms, other than the backstory, is the saving of the seed. You can get a clean seed and a viable
Hmm.
seed typically.
Yeah. And on a longer episode, I challenged the argument of bread and design, but on this episode, I won't. I do think that when you look at kind of hybrids versus heirlooms, there's a philosophical question on, should you really be growing the thing if you have to make these types of changes, if you have to breed these seeds differently to try to combat some issue? So I think that's where I'm going to leave it when it comes to this question. Um,
As soon as my
and
mouth opened and I said that, I
uh,
knew what you would say. And
I was
I'm
going back and forth on whether or not I was going to bring it up, but I
you were either
felt
going to
like,
bring it up now or you're going to bring it up in about 5 minutes and we stop recording. So it's all good. And I'm actually, I would love to have that conversation because hybrids have a really bad name.
yeah.
But the other thing too with them, and remember this, is they're bred to produce heavy. And
Mhm,
so if
mhm.
you have a small space and you need to really crank, you want to get some good harvest out of it, a hybrid may very well be the answer that you're looking for because I mean, I know people that grow like, there's a cucumber that you grow. I think it's the supreme cucumber, if I'm not mistaken. Don't take my word for it, but they won't grow it anymore because it produces so much. So that's a, right there in itself is a
Yeah.
benefit. So I think they've gotten a bad name and the water has been muddied over the years. But remember when you're going through and you're picking everything out for your garden, the variety is very important.
Mhm.
So that being said, make sure that you're doing these things and you will create this synergy within your garden. But if you'd like to support the show, please do so by joining Patreon, becoming a subscriber, or buying yourself some seeds. And download the Planter app. It is planting season, so go ahead and pick that up. And remember, on this show, we do two things. We learn to grow, and we grow for change.
See ya.